Good evening, I'm Leanne Sanders. Welcome to APTN National News. In Winnipeg, a decision on an injunction requested by the city to remove protesters blocking the road to the Brady landfill has been adjourned until Friday morning. It's believed the bodies of 3 Indigenous women could be in that landfill or another landfill north of the city. Supporters and family members put up the blockade after the Premier announced she did not support a search. Now the city and protesters have less than 24 hours to come up with an agreement. Tamara Pimentel has more.
Supporters and families of Morgan Harris and Mercedes Myron held dual demonstrations on Thursday, one at the Brady landfill and at the courthouse in Winnipeg. The city is seeking an injunction to end the blockade, but a judge has again decided to adjourn the ruling for another day, encouraging both sides to come up with a resolution to keep the protests going while opening the road to the landfill. The city's chief administrative officer, Michael Jack, says he's open to any suggestions that reopens the roadway.
We really are all ears. The last thing we want is having to remove anybody or remove the blockade. We'd really like to do everything we can to try and find a compromise here.
A further adjournment may be considered at the request of Sasha Paul, legal representative for the families involved.
I think the right of protest is an important right for my clients, and they're exercising that, and we're hopeful that the court sees it that way.
On Wednesday night, tensions were high as roughly 50 blockade supporters gathered outside the home of a man who was caught dumping soil on a red dress memorial near the landfill. In a Facebook Live video, red paint covered the door and fence surrounding the home. Family spokesperson Robin Johnston says those actions don't reflect those at the camp.
That's not what we're about, okay? I only learned of that last night on social media. As I said yesterday, the folks at Camp Morgan are peaceful people. Just because there's other people over there doesn't mean all Indigenous people are these angry people that are mobs.
Surrounded by roughly a dozen police officers, the man later came out to apologize for his actions. Police say one person was charged with mischief under 5,000 after they allegedly threw a rock through a window. And out at the blockade, supporter Derek Meaches can't understand why the searches are not already underway.
Is it because they don't care? Is it because money? Or is it because, put it this way, we're Indian?
Tamara Pimentel, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
Meanwhile, over at the Assembly of First Nations Annual General Assembly, an emergency resolution was passed late this afternoon that denounces orders and injunctions to remove protesters at the Brady landfill. The AFN also strongly denounced all levels of government for refusing to search for the remains of murdered First Nations women in the Prairie Green landfill. The resolution also calls on Manitoba Premier Heather Stephenson to reconsider the decision not to search the Prairie Green landfill and work together with the federal government to conduct searches of both the Prairie Green landfill and Brady landfill. Grand Chief Kathy Merrick called on the federal government to fund a search and to make a commitment on funding by the end of the month.
I'm sure that each and every one of you in this assembly have been affected by missing and murdered women in our country. And that has to stop. We support everybody else that comes into this country. We support the Ukraine that come into this country. Yet we have our people that live in our First Nations that don't have running water.
For more on this all, we're joined by our regular Truth and Politics panelists. Carrie Benjo is the editor of Eagle Feather News, and Nigan Sinclair is a columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press. Carrie, let's start with you. What's your reaction to Minister Mark Miller's comments, basically calling the Manitoba Premier's decision not to search the landfill heartless?
I think that until the federal government puts up money to fund this search, then I don't think he should be quick to cast blame, because he's equally responsible. Maybe he should, instead of fanning fuels of discontent, he should be reaching out and asking about ways that they can work together to find an amicable solution that would benefit the families, that the families would appreciate. Right now, there's so much infighting and not enough being done, and we're seeing the frustration happening on the ground.
Yeah, and again, last weekend there was a man who dumped trash on an MMIW mural out at the landfill blockade. On Wednesday night, dozens of people showed up at that person's house, as did the police. What do you make of what happened out there?
It's worth noting that it ended peacefully. There was no violence that broke out other than just a bit of a defacing of property. It's also notable to point out that this individual was allowed to come onto an area in which there was a great deal of Indigenous peoples and perform what was essentially a message of hate by dumping garbage or refuse on the top of a mural that they had created. And there was no police there, but there was absolutely 13 police officers to protect this individual at his home. It's very notable to say where the police resources are being located, and it certainly isn't at the site involving individuals who are trying to protect human remains at the landfill site outside of Winnipeg.
Carrie, Minister Miller said the window to start the search has been missed for this year. How hard of news do you think that will be to take?
No harder than the family has already heard. You know, they've just been hearing constant, no, we can't do this. And the solutions that are being proposed are not acceptable. You know, they are standing up and saying, no, this is not acceptable. And they need to have that space to speak, because when I see what they're doing, I understand it, because I'm an Indigenous person, and I know for generations, those before us didn't have this opportunity to speak. We were shut out of anything, and now we have our voice, and our voice can carry. And now they're utilizing their voice and applying pressure, and we see people criticizing them for using their voice. But any other group in the same situation would do the same thing. I don't know why Indigenous people are being vilified in such a way, like they're asking too much. Is it too much that they want their loved ones back? I don't think so.
Nigan, with the injunction and all that's going on, what happens next?
If there are mass arrests made at the site involving I don't like to call it a blockade. I mean, it's really protectors. It's people who are setting up a protection line for human remains, which we know that are there. And so if there is mass arrests by the City of Winnipeg and the police, I think that will create more and more conflict. It's already bubbled over in many different ways. This week you saw the premiers arriving in Winnipeg, and nobody wanted to talk about anything to do with the premier's issues. Not anyone in the national media. Everybody wants to talk about what's happening at the landfill. And therefore, this will increase in conflict. It will also increase in acrimony. And I really think this is in many ways a death knell for the provincial Conservatives, who are already losing massive supports within Winnipeg. But we have a fall election coming up, and they may face a tremendous loss in Winnipeg just over this issue alone.
Yeah, interesting times for sure, and I guess we'll see how it plays out. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, miigwech.
Thanks.
In other news, a familiar face turned up at the Assembly of First Nations meeting in Halifax on Thursday morning. Former Attorney General Jody WilsonRaybould gave a keynote speech to delegates. She chose to talk about the Trudeau government's United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Action Plan and where it falls short. APTN's Fraser Needham has more from the last day of the Assembly.
WilsonRaybould received a warm welcome when she took the podium, but she did not have kind words for the Liberal government. She told delegates that the highest levels of government still fail to understand what true reconciliation means.
Many of people in positions of power still do not get it. They have told, or I have told many stories of sitting around with government colleagues and speaking about the recognition of Indigenous rights and the implementation of treaties and how to make transformative change to support self-determination, including self-government, and how it was like I was from a different planet.
Terry Teague is the Assembly of First Nations Regional Chief for British Columbia, where that province is implementing its own UNDRIP action plan. He says it has been easier for the First Nations in BC to work with the provincial bureaucrats when compared to Ottawa.
We're 4 years into implementing our action plan for the province of BC. I think the partnership there is good. There has been some progress with Section 6, 7 agreements, also amendments made to a number of legislation in British Columbia. I think for British Columbia, there's, I suppose, for the bureaucrats that are there, it is going to be a bit easier.
In his address to delegates, Minister of Justice David Lametti said the action plan is flexible enough to incorporate changes that will work for all Indigenous peoples.
The action plan itself is something we use as a process to work together, and we can address questions like redress through the basic principles that are articulated in the action plan itself. So again, I'm optimistic that this will be transformational in a number of different ways.
In an interview with APTN News after her speech, WilsonRaybould was asked if she will run for national chief.
I mean, honestly, it hasn't been on my radar. Like, I was invited here prior to the whole resolutions around the national chief. I mean, I fundamentally believe in the work that our leadership across the country is doing.
Later in the day, Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Mark Miller addressed the Assembly. He began by speaking out about the landfill crisis in Winnipeg. Miller again criticized the province of Manitoba for not funding a search.
It's not fair. It's not fair to you, and it's not the right thing to do. So as a federal government, we absolutely commit to try, and we're ready and willing to help. We'll continue working.
Fraser Needham, APTN National News, Jibuktuk, also known as Halifax.
Manitoba's Premier Heather Stephenson fired back with a statement just a short while ago. She says Minister Mark Miller's comments are, quote, more than unfortunate, adding when judgment and sensitivity are required, he has chosen to inflame and distort. She reiterates the landfill search is not viable and there are no guarantees on an outcome. It's time for a quick break. Still to come, a look at the latest numbers on suicide in Quebec. Welcome back. It's a newly released statistic. More than 1,000 people died by suicide in Quebec in 2020. However, for years, suicide rates among the Indigenous population have been higher than anywhere else. Advocates say mistrust in police and lack of resources are perpetuating the crisis. Here's Maricela Amador with more.
We're in Cabot Square, an urban park in downtown Montreal, which has a substantial homeless Indigenous population. The park may be quiet today, but a few years ago, a heavy-handed police intervention left frontline workers shocked.
We had an Indigenous woman in distress for quite a lengthy period, a number of hours, and I'd spent quite a lot of time with her. Eventually, she came to the place where she asked for an ambulance, and I was happy about that.
David Chapman is the executive director of Resilience Montreal, an Indigenous Day center located just around the corner. On that day, he called 911 requesting an ambulance, but instead, a dozen police officers and a K-9 unit arrived.
And that created a new problem where the woman essentially became very agitated and, and looked at me and said, hey, I requested an ambulance, not a big group of police.
Chapman was forced to mediate, and the woman ended up being taken to the hospital by ambulance, but the encounter left many uneasy.
What's difficult is that this woman was suicidal. She was only wanting to do harm to herself. So when, I don't know, 7 cop cars show up and a canine unit, so you have to understand it's an actual truck with dogs in it that are barking. And that is very overwhelming to everyone who was in the park, but especially that woman.
Nakuset says incidents like this are not uncommon across Montreal, feeding distrust of police and causing mental health interventions to escalate.
It's really it's like a stain on the face of the police.
Passons maintenant au 7e thème. In mid-June, a Quebec coroner inquiry on suicides in the province made 63 recommendations on prevention.
La présente enquête concerne 6 décès et c'est 6 décès qui avaient des enjeux similaires. La volonté, c'était de faire une enquête publique sur la thématique des troubles concomitants et du suicide.
While the report was not Indigenous specific, it focused on how the response by police, health professionals, and organizations might contribute to otherwise avoidable deaths. One recommendation? Implementing mixed police squads, pairing police officers with mental health professionals during crisis interventions. Like the one Montreal Police created in 2012, they doubled their staff in 2021 to focus on prevention and assisting vulnerable populations.
ESUP, en 2022, à elle seule a fait plus de 2020 interventions dans l'année. Ce qui démontre clairement le besoin de ces équipes-là, ce qui démontre clairement la nécessité et le bienfait de ces équipes-là.
Montreal Police also has a mixed team that specifically works with the Indigenous population in Montreal.
Indigenous people have 6 times as much chances of being stopped as white.
However, a recent report by them shows they're still subjecting Indigenous women to random street checks at a rate several times higher than anyone else, stoking doubt about their ability to help those in crisis.
If they acknowledge the harm they've done, if they offer some kind of steps to reverse the harm, that would be helpful.
This topic also came up during a recent council meeting in Val-d'Or, when the mayor stressed the need for more police resources to deal with the urban Indigenous population.
On travaille en appui avec la Sûreté du Québec. On travaille en appui avec le CISAC.
Val-d'Or has used mixed squads since 2016, but employees of their Native Friendship Center see a need for cultural training.
Cette approche culturelle est nécessaire et très bien intégrée à même le Centre d'Amis autochtones. Alors nous, on agit comme partenaire auprès des comme partenaire pour s'assurer de les accompagner dans une approche qui est culturellement adaptée.
But that is only one aspect of suicide prevention. Indigenous communities up north are in desperate need of additional resources across the board. In January, the Quebec Human Rights Commission began investigating after 5 youths died by suicide in a span of 5 months last year in the community of Lac-Simon.
Il y a beaucoup de gens impliqués chez nous qui se manifestent par solidarité, mais aussi notre organisation fait du mieux qu'elle peut avec les moyens qu'elle peut. On n'a pas tous les moyens. On n'a pas les mêmes moyens fédéraux ou provinciaux qu'eux ont. Ils ont des professionnels, mais chez nous, c'est un besoin qui est criant.
Across Canada, the First Nations suicide rate is 3 times higher than the suicide rate among non-Indigenous people. Advocates say that even at the federal level, prevention plans are failing. But here in Quebec, there's still hope for change.
I think that if they have the right cultural training, yes. But are they having that cultural training, right? That's the problem.
Maricela Amador, APTN National News, Montreal.
If you're experiencing emotional distress and want to talk, call the Hope for Wellness helpline at 1-855-242-3310. It's time for one last quick break. When we return, we'll continue our look at preparations for the North American Indigenous Games. Be right back. Welcome back. Time now for our photo of the day. This was sent in by Rebecca Sirocco, a member of the Mi'kmaq Nation, and this was the view on an early morning near Membertou, Nova Scotia. What a beautiful moment captured by Rebecca. To be featured as our next photo of the day, send your pictures to share@aptn.ca. Now let's take a look at tomorrow's weather forecast. On the East Coast, St. John's is 22. It's warmer in Charlottetown, 28. Nain is 12, Happy Valley Goose Bay 28. Sept-Îles is 18, and on the warmer side, Montreal's 26. 26 in Sarnia, 27 in Windsor, 25 in Kapuskasing, Thunder Bay's 22. Churchill 13, Norway House is 21, 24 in Winnipeg at the hotspot, and Barons River is 18. Saskatoon and North Battleford 25, Swift Current is 24. Uranium City 20, Buffalo Narrows is 19. Fort McMurray 22, Peace River and High Level 25. Edmonton and Calgary 23, Medicine Hat the hotspot at 27. Bella Coola, Quesnel 27, Kamloops 33. Dease Lake is 26, Smithers 28. Rock River is 17 and 25 in Whitehorse and Watson Lake. Wrigley, Fort Simpson and Trout Lake 28. Tuktoyaktuk 15, Inuvik 19. Baker Lake is 13 and Whale Cove 13. Igloolik is 7 and Pangatung is 7. Now for another athlete profile from Team Saskatchewan. Askaya Tutusis will be playing soccer for Team Sask in Halifax. Tutusis originally tried out for the cross-country team. He didn't make it, but that didn't stop him. He pushed himself to train for the last 2 years and be a better athlete. Tutusis did that by challenging himself to work out regularly. Now that he is on Team Sask, he's looking forward to meeting new people at NAG from across North America. Tutusis adds that sports is helping him be a better person, and he encourages other youth to get into sports.
I am in grade 10. I'm 16 years old and I play soccer. It overall helps with my mental health and makes me a better person in general. You know, I learn a lot of skills from sports that I could put into real life, and it really, you know, lowers any stress and anxiety I would have.
And that's all the time we have for you tonight. If you'd like to hear more on these stories and more, head over to aptnnews.ca. I'm Leanne Sanders. Thanks for joining us. Have a great evening.